Psychology is not a real science. You studied psychology to read minds. Psychology is just common sense. Everyone can put A and B together and guess what will happen or what happened. I heard this a lot before I studied psychology and after I studied psychology, and still I hear it a lot. And in this video I wanted to touch base on what psychology is and what it certainly isn't. Well, there are a lot of myths about psychology, and social media, news outlets, they don't help because we refer to them as pop psychology. They attach wrong labels, they put together wrong news, presenting psychology as something that armchair specialists just sit and decide and judge on. To start with, at the moment, psychology is a scientific study. It has fought a lot, and I will explain a bit later why, to be accepted as a scientific study with validity and rigor behind most of the research that is coming out. It's scientific study of behavior and mental processes. When we say behavior, a couple of examples that could be classified as behavior are observable actions, facial expressions, reaction times, speech, decisions, patterns, relationships. There are many psychological researchers who also measure the reactions based on the brain MRIs, based on the eye movements, and many different measurable variables. When we say mental processes, we refer to thoughts, emotions, memory, attention, and perception, among many other things. However, when we say psychology is a science, it has fought for a long time to become a science. The reason being was that there was a lot of research that was not replicable. It was not a valid research in a sense that any researcher, any psychologist could put together numbers. In fact, there were a lot of scandals about wrong or invalid research figures that were just fabricated and were not true. The reason for that was lack of replication. Okay? Replication is essentially when someone can take the same experiment or research that you do, based on the descriptions that you have in the research paper, repeat it step by step and get the same results that you did. Well, it's not always possible in psychology because you may learn or experiment on different populations. Most psychological research is related to weird nations. Weird means Western, educated, industrialized, I forgot what, rich and developed. That's why there are a lot of populations that there is not enough research, we don't have enough research about them. That's why the scientific research in psychology may not be specifically replicated on all populations, but ideally is if we are replicating it in a more or less similar population, we should get similar results. And not long ago, up to 66% of research in psychology could not be replicated, meaning that research cannot be considered a scientific piece of information because we cannot replicate it and it's not rigorous. When we say science, the normal path that research in psychology follows is observation, question, hypothesis, experiment, results, and replication, depending on the research methods that you use. Well, I don't want to make this video very research-oriented, but I just want to provide a foundation why when people say that psychology is not a science, they are not correct. Because respectable psychological research follows the research process, which also includes replication after results are published, and it includes pre-registration. Pre-registration means that you publish your research methods, what you are going to do in the research, before you actually conduct the research, for a peer review to understand what you are going to do in your research and provide feedback. It also, of course, includes peer review. When your peers from the similar field review what you have done and to understand whether the research looks to be valid or not. But all in all, it follows the decisions that are made in psychology, in scientific psychology, follow rigorous scientific path for research to be complete. How do we make... One of other myths is that psychology is just common sense. How can you measure many things that psychology studies? Because behavior and mental processes, these things can be so ambiguous. How do you put it together to make a research paper out of it, to put it in a research? Well, we first work with operational definitions, okay? Operational definitions means that you're taking a certain behavior or a certain concept and you try to operationalize it. For example, we have stress, okay? Someone can be more stressful than another person and it's very difficult to understand how stressful you are. That's why we have several methods to measure stress. One of them is a stress scale, 1 to 10, and each of them has a different definition of how stressful you are. Then we have cortisol test. Cortisol is a hormone that stands behind stress, and we do the saliva test to measure cortisol hormone. However, it's a more complex way to do it because you need to measure it at different times during the day, at night, in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening to understand it. All in all, stress can be operationalized to put it into research, to make it measurable. Now, next, after the operational definition, we need to come up with measurable variables. For example, if we're researching that stress, 8 hours of sleep reduce stress. That's how we measure variables that may affect the stress. For example, the number of hours we sleep can be the variable that can be measured and that affects the stress, it reduces it. Or the amount of time we walk, the amount of steps we do can reduce stress. In a similar fashion, it becomes a measurable variable. After we have the operational definition of what we're researching and a measurable variable, we can go on to statistical analysis. And this video is not an in-depth review of research methods. That's why you can understand it as whether statistical analysis, if it's quantitative methods, then you do the regression analysis, t-tests, or any other type of quantitative analysis that is fit for your study, or you do a qualitative analysis. And then at the end, of course, as we said, we have peer review, which is very important for psychological papers, because as I said, the behaviors and mental process can be ambiguous. And when you work with people populations that can be different, every person is different, peer review helps to understand gaps in the research, to fine-tune it, and when it's replicated, to replicate it on a better level. Psychology is full of myths, full of myths. People think they know, when in reality they don't. And that's why it's important to have a scientific approach. Why? Because, for example, I've heard it a lot as I was growing up. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So the more stress you have as you grow up, the more stressful challenges you have, the more turbulent atmosphere you have when you grow up in your household, the stronger you become. This is not true. Children who grow up in a more stressful households have more challenges and mental challenges in life or mental challenges as they grow up. So this is just not true. Multitasking. It was believed that people who multitask, they are more efficient. And this proves to be not true. Because you have psychology, the science, research shows that you have a certain amount of attention span. And if you divide it, imagine you have a pizza, you have a limited amount of attention span. And if you divide it into small pieces, every task gets only a small piece of your attention. And then you also have switching costs when you switch your attention from one task to another. Whereas if you focus on one task and finish it, that one task will get more of your attention, your whole attention span, which will help in progressing that task faster. Multitasking helps with tasks. That's not true. We cannot avoid multitasking sometimes, but the myths that we have about them are not true. Then hindsight bias. It's very common, especially for older generation, to tell the younger generation, I knew it. I told you so. Or you may see it in a conversation between a husband and the wife, where she tells him, I knew it, I told you, you did what you wanted, and you see what happened. Well, that's just hindsight bias. When we think that at that point we knew how it will end up, but realistically, we don't analyze, we don't know how we felt before, in the past. And when we fall into hindsight bias, we think we knew the answer, but realistically in the past, we didn't. Then another myth that venting anger is when someone gets angry and we tell them, you need to vent it, just, I don't know, break a couple of plates, try to attend boxing lessons, or try to beat the pillow so that you vent your anger and you become less angry. Research shows that venting anger actually increases the anger and it doesn't reduce it. Then one more myth that I wanted to add here is witness memory. So we tend to believe that witnesses remember everything. They remember the scene as it happened, and they remember people that were at the scene. However, it has been a known case, a known concept that they don't. If you remember the series called Downton Abbey, there was an investigation. It was a period drama, British period drama, and they were investigating a murder case. Then the witness was taken to a police office, let's say, and then the witness said that they identified a certain man. Let's say the man had blonde hair. Then what the police would do according to the procedure, they would have a suspect, one of them, and they would collect 3 more men that look like a suspect. They may be from the same village or from neighboring towns. And then these 4 men would stand in front of the witness, and witness would have to identify whom they saw. If the witness doesn't identify the man that they have in custody, then there we have a reasonable doubt that the witness could be wrong about what they saw. Later, a couple of decades later, it was actually researched and proven that witness testimony about what they saw, especially the people they saw at the scene, may be wrong because of how many things that happened, and memory recollection cannot be 100% accurate. Now we briefly discussed very common myths in psychology. I just wanted also to point out the different roles that we have in psychology that are also quite confusing for many, and many countries have different systems. Western countries like US, Europe have certain path for a psychologist, but some other countries may different paths. We will focus on what Western countries have here. We have a psychologist who is not a medical doctor. Psychologist is not a medical doctor, okay? And even clinical psychologists, they are not medical doctors. They cannot prescribe any pills. In some countries, clinical psychologists can prescribe minor medications, but nothing like what psychiatrists can prescribe. Psychiatrists are medical doctors. For the record, Freud, one of the most popular figures in psychology, was a medically trained doctor as well, who can prescribe prescriptions. They see patients with a more complex issues like schizophrenia or recurring panic attacks, the more complex mental issues. For example, Tony Soprano in The Sopranos was seeing a psychiatrist because of the recurring. Well, he had a panic attack once or twice at the point when he was seeing Dr. Melfi, but he had a history of panic attacks from the childhood as well. How do they define what can be classified as schizophrenia or a personal disorder? It's very common now for people to say, you have an OCD, and he's a narcissist, and he's a psychopath, and he's this, and he's that. Well, after studying psychology and seeing the interviews of people who, for example, really do have an obsessive-compulsive disorder, I can see that most of the people who are blamed for having obsessive-compulsive disorder don't really have it. Well, we have a diagnostic DSM-5, which is Diagnostic Manual of Mental Disorders, and some countries use ICD-11, which is also the manual with all criteria for mental disorders. It contains everything that has been studied so far, and the remedies, the therapy types that have been applied and proven to be to either bring the patients to the remission or help the patients to cure the disorder. That's why as we move forward, as more evidence emerge, they get updated. So before DSM-5 there was DSM-4, and likewise before ICD-11 there was 10, 9, 8, and so forth. We have psychologists, we have psychiatrists, and there we have therapists and the counselor. Therapists and counselors, they don't necessarily have a degree in psychology. To become a therapist, you usually take a long training, which includes the knowledge that you would get in a psychology degree. And therapists don't necessarily participate in psychological research because they may not have the degree in psychology. However, the counselors, for example, they can be social workers or part of public organizations that help people to go through certain period of their lives. New adjustments, grief, certain periods of their lives where they need a counselor just to help them, to give them a nudge to go through that period. Not every psychologist is a therapist. It's important to understand that. So I have a degree in psychology and now I am in psychotherapist training. However, if I wouldn't go into psychotherapist training, I wouldn't be able to become a therapist. With the degree in psychology, I would be able to continue a research in psychology. And that's what I was trained for in a degree. And that's what's important to understand. It's very common that if you graduate from a degree in psychology, you're like, oh, you're a psychologist, let's talk. Or you're a psychologist, what's she talking about? What is he saying? What do you think she's thinking about? That's very common. But a degree is in psychology doesn't mean that you would necessarily be working with people right away. However, if you study psychology, there are a lot of different cross-sectional fields where psychologists work. You would be surprised, but companies like Apple, Porsche, BMW, they employ good consumer psychologists to understand what their consumers would like to see. They measure the reaction times of people when they see different designs of the phone or of the car. For example, they present different types of cars with different designs, and they see the reaction times, how the people reacted, what they felt when they reacted to it. And that contributes to their research, part of their R&D expense, research and development expense, to come up with a car that would be most attractive to the niche, the population that they're looking for. We have clinical psychologists, which is very common. They obviously treat people. They help people with all sorts of different disorders if it is at their level, otherwise they refer them to a psychiatrist. Then we have cognitive psychology, which studies the processes, cognitive processes, including executive functioning, learning. They help us to learn more efficiently, to learn better. If they study the learning process, of course. Then we have developmental psychology, which is very interesting. It studies how we change and adjust throughout our lifetime. A huge focus of developmental psychology is early years, children in their young age. For example, the effectiveness of concepts like Montessori learning or kids learning certain things at certain ages came from developmental psychology, which studied how it is best for kids to develop and what happens to them when they are exposed to certain activities. We have social psychology, which studies how people, how society affects us and how we affect the society. Social psychologists can be very useful, especially in political movements, in propaganda. One of the prominent examples was the nephew, I think, of Freud. You should watch a documentary on BBC about it, how he helped to promote women smoking in the US so that the tobacco companies could get higher incomes. Well, we also study biological psychology, also may refer as a physiological psychology. It studies how biological processes in us and around us affect us. In what way? Then we have forensic psychology, which I think doesn't need an extra introduction. Many people know about it. We look at the legal process and the crimes through the lens of psychology to understand it better. It has been a lot of help to the legislation, to the jurisdiction system, in promoting the faster and better ways of analyzing the crimes. Then we have the consumer psychology, we discussed it, how consumers make decisions that they make. Then we have sports psychology. It's about it's about studying the psychology of athletes, how athletes, those people who are in big sport, make decisions, how we can help people who are talented, who are hardworking enough to go into big sports, and so on and so forth. Then we have health psychology. It's about the choices that we make about our health and the choices populations make. Certain, for example, teenagers or young people or seniors make about their health. Then we have educational psychology, which is very interesting as well. It's basically, the niche are the people who are studying something, who are in education. It's about assisting them to learn better, to find the tailored ways for them to learn, or even to help them direct them better based on their abilities and on the career paths or the future paths that they see for themselves. That was all for this video. I hope we were able to debunk some of the myths that we have about psychology and shed a bit more light about what psychology actually does as a science and not a pop myth that we have on the internet.